Nancy Cunard was a revolutionary spirit wrapped in scandal and style. Heiress to the illustrious Cunard shipping dynasty, Nancy could have lived a life of ease and opulence. Instead, she defied societal expectations, morphing from a glamorous it-girl and literary muse into a fearless publisher and civil rights crusader. Her journey took her from the glittering parties of the elite to the slums of Harlem to the war-torn fronts of the Spanish Civil War. Nancy's striking appearance and unique style of turbans, dramatic kohl-lined eyes, and stacks of ivory and ebony bangles made her a fashion icon. She was a muse and lover to many of the greats of her generation, including George Bernard Shaw, Aldous Huxley, T.S. Eliot, and Pablo Neruda, appearing as a character in many of their works. Her tumultuous affair with black jazz musician Henry Crowder and her relentless quest for racial equality scandalized London society, estranging her from her aristocratic mother and making her a target of the Ku Klux Klan. Yet beneath the allure and activism, Nancy struggled with inner demons: alcoholism, violent mood swings, and anorexia. Her life, a whirlwind of glamour, love affairs, and fighting for causes, ended in tragic isolation as she died penniless, shunned by her friends, and half-mad in a London hotel room. Her final words echoing the torment of her lifelong struggles and addiction. Join us this week as we delve into the extraordinary and scandalous life of Nancy Cunard. Nancy Cunard was born on March 10, 1896. Her father, Sir Bache Cunard, was the heir to the Cunard shipping fortune, founded by his grandfather. Cunard shipping was renowned for creating the Lusitania, a ship famously sunk by a German U-boat, prompting the U.S. to enter World War I. Despite his wealth, Sir Bache needed a rich American wife to maintain his estate. Her mother, Maud Alice Burke, was 23, blonde, blue-eyed, and spirited, with a $2 million dowry. She sought a title, and he sought money. By the time she gave birth a year into their marriage, Maud felt it was a mistake, stating, "Motherhood is a low thing, the lowest, and I will never get pregnant again." Nancy had a lonely childhood. Her parents rarely spent time together or with her. While it was typical for children then to stay with governesses or nannies, her parents often left her alone for weeks or months. Nancy later described herself as a detached, solitary child, receiving no physical affection from either parent. George Moore, a writer and family friend, was the only person who encouraged her in reading and poetry. Rumors suggested Moore was her biological father, but this is not true. In addition, her tyrannical governess scolded Nancy for any perceived wrongdoing and made her sit for hours if she didn't eat every morsel on her plate. Nancy loathed her, and this likely contributed to the eating disorder she had throughout her life. Her mother, Maud, was deeply in love with Thomas Beecham, a conductor, and set up a house near him in Cavendish Square, taking Nancy with her, causing the Queen herself to criticize the all-too-public affair. She was a bright child and learned to speak 5 languages. She studied in Munich and attended finishing school in Paris, where she devoured Russian literature and fell in love with the city. As Nancy approached her 18th birthday and coming out, her mother began to show real interest, hoping Nancy would find a match in high society. Nancy was considered a beauty and had many admirers, but she resisted dressing as her mother wanted, preferring her own style. She sulked at the ridiculous ceremony of her presentation at court, where she had to curtsy before the Queen. Debutante parties bored her. "It is all the same dull men, having the same vapid conversations," she wrote. Her beauty struck the Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, who showed interest, but she refused his affections, to her mother's great dismay, finding him boring. She showed up late for balls and parties, preferring to go out with her friends to London's Soho clubs and mingle with poets, writers, and artists. She felt it was a different, more authentic world than the one her mother wanted for her. When World War I began, anxiety filled London, and Nancy started drinking more, spending nights out partying with friends. She began having nightmares about what people she knew were experiencing at the front and listened to the soldiers' stories. She felt ashamed of her own privileged safety. In her 1916 poem Remorse, she described herself as wasteful and wanton. Depressed and filled with guilt, she met Sidney Fairbairn, a soldier recovering from war injuries. They had little in common, but he fell deeply in love with her. Seeing it as a way to escape her mother's house, Nancy agreed to marry him. Their marriage was unhappy from the start. Sidney was sociable and often invited his army friends over, where they spoke of sports and regimental matters. Nancy felt stifled and unable to focus on her poetry. By the time he was well enough to return to the war, Nancy was happy to be rid of him. After he left, she began a brief affair with T.S. Eliot, having read The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock and been deeply inspired by it. Soon, though, she had fallen in love with another soldier, Peter Adderley, who was home on leave. They would read to each other in her garden and was sure she would divorce Sidney when the war was over. However, when Peter returned to the war, he was shot in the stomach and died. Some of her friends would later say that if Peter had lived, her life would have been much different, and his death led to her ultimate ruin. Nonetheless, she now resented Sidney for having survived and wanted little to do with him. As the war ended, she also wanted to be out of London. In Britain, the female population now outnumbered the male by 2 million, and behaviors such as drinking and smoking by women, which had been overlooked during the war, were now seen as a sign of low moral character. For Nancy, the simplest remedies for despair were alcohol and sex, and in France she found both in abundant supply. Her writings from this period show a woman in great despair. Her diary is filled with notes reminding herself to laugh, flirt, or act in a certain way. Alcohol smooths down the bitter silences, dissipates the nerves, and dissipates my shyness, she wrote. She hated herself for the hope she invested in each new lover and the speed with which she grew bored with them. How odd I am in the way I pick up with people, get to know them terribly well, and then jump every time the mechanism works and the doll speaks. I seem to want too much, then mountains of unhappiness, she wrote. After suffering a breakdown, Nancy moved back in with Maud, and their relationship was bitter. Her ladyship only gives me what she is forced to, she remarked. She collapsed after frenetic drinking and emotional despair and was put into a nursing home to recover. Once she recovered, she began the cycle again, soon engaging in an affair with poet Robert Nichols, who threatened to kill himself if she did not return his love. Nancy then entered a more serious relationship with novelist and playwright Michael Arlen, who based a character on her in his novel, The Green Hat. He wanted to marry her, which enraged her, as she had sworn never to marry again after her experience with Sidney. She also felt he was mining her life for details, with his characters being exaggerated versions of her. During this time, she had a procedure, possibly to terminate a pregnancy, which was botched and led to a hysterectomy. This major surgical event in 1920 resulted in many near-fatal infections. Arlen wrote about her suffering in his novels, making her feel deeply betrayed. When she recovered, she grew familiar with the left bank crowd, including Pound, the Fitzgeralds, and Stein. The papers tracked her movements around Europe, presenting an image of a rich and confident woman. Miss Nancy Cunard carries out her ideas with courage and success. She was one of the first to adopt the Eton crop, one paper said. Behind the veneer, she was growing thinner and thinner, surviving on champagne or white wine. Year by year, she became more critical of her mother. In 1926, when Maud changed her name to Emerald on the advice of a numerologist, Nancy refused to acknowledge it. She desperately wanted to find love, but equally feared being trapped. In the spring of 1922, she began a brief affair with writer Aldous Huxley, who called her a maddening enigma. She was receptive to his interest, but said of his lovemaking, it was like being crawled over by slugs. A version of her appeared in 3 of his works, most notably as the character Myra Nancy in Anti-K. He was completely taken by her until his wife dragged him away to Italy. Writers scrambled for adjectives to describe her. To David Garnett, her skin was as white as bleached almonds. To Harold Acton, her head was carved out of crystal. To William Carlos Williams, she was a tall blonde spike of a woman. To George Moore, she had a back as long as a weasel's. She dressed in turbans and scarves, enormous African earrings, and ivory bangles. Her eyes were elongated with dramatic kohl, and her lipstick a line of scarlet that gave her mouth dramatic tension. Yet she did not want to be defined by her appearance. She wanted to be defined by her writing. During the first half of the decade, she wrote poems, trying to hone her style, and had 3 volumes of her poetry published. She received some praise, but many critics believed it unoriginal, and she began to doubt herself. During this time, Nancy launched a small publishing venture funded by her father. Although her relationship with Sir Bache had become strained, she loved him dearly. When his health began to fail in 1925, she stayed with him until his death, recalling that they grew closer during this period. She also began dating Louis Aragon, a founder of the Surrealist movement, whom she called delicious. He lectured her on the authenticity of Black culture and the decadence of Europe. Their relationship was contentious. Nancy financed their lifestyle and mocked him for it. During a trip to Venice, tensions escalated and Aragon threatened to kill himself. Nancy callously taunted him, saying he lacked the courage. Aragon stormed out and was later found after an overdose of sleeping pills. He recovered, but immediately left for Paris, declaring he would do it again if he stayed with Nancy. Nancy was indifferent to his departure and stayed behind in Venice, where she soon found a new love. At a local bar, she met Black pianist Henry Crowder. She was completely taken by him. At first, he was reticent, but they soon began an affair that would scandalize society. Harry had grown up in a poor town in Georgia, playing for the church choir and learning music at the YMCA. He had worked his way around America, washing dishes and playing piano at a brothel, until he became a respected name on the Washington jazz scene. His band was offered a chance to play in Europe. She was so bright and fragile, I became infatuated beyond all reason, he said. In Georgia, a Black man could be lynched for having an affair with a white woman, and said he felt both terror and euphoria at their relationship. After the summer crowd departed, Nancy and Henry faced increased scrutiny. People hurled insults, and black-shirted fascists watched them closely. Fearing for their safety, she asked him to return with her to Paris. Nancy later claimed he was the only man who never bored her and could absorb her emotional storms. When one of Nancy's friends saw Henry with cuts and bruises on his face, clearly from Nancy's bangles, she asked him about it. He replied meekly, "Just bracelet work, Miss Janet." Despite her delight in Henry's company, Nancy continued to see other men, including Louis Aragon, now engaged. Aragon's fiancé spoke of Nancy's snake-like power over him. After every meeting, he returned more broken. Nancy also had affairs with other members of Henry's band. Even in liberal Paris, gossip and slurs tainted Nancy's name, leading some friends to avoid her. Henry, however, thrived in Paris, feeling intellectually enriched and gaining some fame. Despite her egalitarian ideals, Nancy insulted Henry for his lack of money and accused him of laziness when he angered her. Nancy grew increasingly thin, ricocheting between affairs, including one with another Black piano player. Her health deteriorated, and it was said by her lovers that she lacked tenderness in love and sex. Her hysterectomy and subsequent infections had made it difficult for her to achieve pleasure, leading her to desire rougher and more aggressive sex. Henry, feeling played for a fool, threatened to return to America. Later, Nancy would claim Henry was the man she loved the most and expressed regret for abusing and taking him for granted. The more Nancy interacted with Henry, the more she began to understand and sympathize with the plight of Black men in America. Initially, she wanted him to take her to Africa, believing he needed to rediscover his roots. He replied, "I ain't African, I'm American," and through him, Nancy slowly grasped the reality of being a Black American. She delved into his past, learning about life in Georgia, segregation, race riots, and the Ku Klux Klan. Her indignation grew, and her previously vague political sympathies crystallized into a focused passion for the Black cause. Determined to make a difference, she decided to publish an anthology of Black art and history, documenting centuries of persecution. Researching and commissioning essays, art, poems, photographs, and stories for the 850-page work Negro, which consumed her time, energy, and much of her money. She traveled with Henry to New York and was one of the first white women to stay in a Harlem hotel. The press portrayed her as a depraved English lady with a taste for Black flesh. She received hate mail, calling her horrible slurs, including one from the Ku Klux Klan. "I hope when you try to free the lousy down in Alabama, the white people will lynch you." The book alienated her from most of her friends and dealt the final fatal blow to her and her mother's relationship. Everyone knew about the relationship, but her mother, Maud, never spoke of it until she was confronted by her old friend and rival, Margot Asquith, who inquired loudly about her daughter in front of everyone at a lunch party. "How is old Nancy? What is it now, drink, drugs, or..." Maud was humiliated in the social circles she so loved. She hired private detectives to follow them and tried to get Henry arrested and deported. Nancy was sickened by her mother's behavior, and Maud's plans to reduce her allowance fueled her anger. In response, Nancy penned 2 vitriolic essays aimed directly at her mother. The first, a satirical piece titled "Does Anyone Know Any Negroes?" echoed Maud's own words. The second, "Black Man and White Ladyship," was a scathing personal attack. Ostensibly an 11-page history of institutional racism, a third of it condemned her mother's snobbery, extravagance, and prejudice. Nancy's hatred coursed through the essay, mercilessly mocking her mother. The target of her writing was clear to all. She sent copies to her mother and her entire social circle, including the Prince of Wales. Readers were horrified. Some friends claimed Nancy was mentally ill, attributing her actions to her drinking and deteriorating health. Even Henry believed she was close to a breakdown and begged her not to send the essays, but Nancy, as always, was unyielding. Maud dismissed the essays with a simple remark: "One can almost forgive anyone anything who is ill." But Nancy sought no forgiveness. She never saw her mother again, nor did she write to her. Abandoning the Parisian world and the parties of her youth, she dedicated the rest of her life to causes she believed in. However, her relationship with Henry fell apart as he grew weary of her infidelities and emotional outbursts, finally ending their tumultuous affair. Henry was her last great love, and years after their relationship ended, she traveled to Venice and from her balcony poured wine into the canal and simply said, "For Henry." The outbreak of the Spanish Civil War offered Nancy a new purpose. In 1936, she was sent by the Negro press to Barcelona to report on the war. She fell in love with the country and its people, seeing in Spain the world's struggle for freedom. Writers, poets, and idealists converged there, and she felt part of a unified movement. She believed the battle against Franco would shape the future of the free world. Nancy ventured into the most dangerous areas to speak with people and lend a hand. Even after the Republican Army's defeat, Nancy stayed in the refugee camps, gathering their stories. Her reporting sparked a relief campaign, bringing in much-needed money, support, and supplies. In 1941, the war left her with little choice but to return to London. There, she translated for the Free French Forces and wrote about the desecration of France. After the war, she wandered from place to place, raging against Franco's leadership and the treatment of blacks. But she lacked the energy, finances, and influential friends to make a significant impact. Despite this, she had no trouble finding friends and lovers, though few became close to her. As usual, these friendships and loves ended quickly. Surviving on cigarettes and wine, she maintained her stylish dress and bangles. In 1948, when Maud was dying, Nancy was asked to visit, but Lady Cunard did not request to see her, and Nancy had no interest in seeing her mother. During the late 1950s in Spain, Nancy's behavior grew increasingly erratic. She picked political fights with strangers, made public condemnations of the government, and demanded the release of political prisoners. Her actions led to arrest and deportation. By the time she returned to London, she was emotionally fractured and deeply paranoid. Friends who tried to help were branded fascist spies. She roamed the streets, hurling insults at policemen and making outrageous sexual advances at strangers. Eventually, she was arrested and placed in a sanatorium. In letters to friends, she lamented her life's futility, feeling she had failed to find love, become a poet, or make a difference in the world. Upon her release, her physical health deteriorated rapidly. Diagnosed with emphysema, she numbed herself with increasing amounts of alcohol. In 1965, she suffered a bad fall, tripping and breaking her thigh. Mixing prescription drugs with alcohol, Nancy spiraled into madness. She refused to eat, becoming violent and rude to everyone around her. Her mind was cracked, a friend said. All she did was insult everyone. Convinced her doctor was part of a fascist conspiracy, she set fire to her papers and tried to escape. The taxi driver, seeing her state, drove her to a police station. 2 days later, in the ward of a public hospital, she died. Her final words, spoken in a hotel room with her eyes closed, was champagne. The Evening Standard wrote of her death, a sad, lonely farewell to the toast of the 20s. Nancy Cunard's life, once glittering with the allure of high society and literary brilliance, had ended in obscurity and isolation. Her life remains complex. Although she rejected high society, she lived a life entirely funded by it. Her rebellion against her privileged upbringing was fueled by a desire to break free from societal expectations and to champion the causes of the marginalized. Her relationships with literary giants, her advocacy for civil rights, and her bohemian lifestyle painted a picture of a woman ahead of her time. Yet, through it all, her diary paints a picture of a deeply unhappy woman. I hope you enjoyed the story of Nancy Cunard. Let me know in the comments your opinion of her life and this story. I love hearing from you. And as always, thanks for watching.